Hello, everybody. A very warm welcome to today's webinar, which will launch the Global Biolabs Report 2023. My name is Dr. Philippa Lenzos. I'm an Associate Professor of Science and International Security at King's College London. I'm speaking to you today from the United Nations in Geneva on the sidelines of a meeting of states party to the Biological Weapons Convention and within a short distance from the WHO, the World Health Organization. These are two of the key stakeholders that we are targeting with our report and our recommendations. We are also very pleased that so many scientists, biosafety, biosecurity experts, government officials, science communicators, and journalists, and other interested members of the public are with us on the call today. It's great to have you all here. My co-lead on the Global Biolabs Initiative is Dr. Gregory Koblenz. Greg is an associate professor and director of the Biodefense Graduate Program at George Mason University, and you'll meet him very shortly. Greg and I launched the Global Biolabs Initiative in May 2021 with the aim of creating an authoritative and publicly available resource that tracks maximum containment labs around the world. Since its launch in May 2021, the resource that we developed, globalbiolabs.org, has hosted over 63,000 unique visitors and consistently hosts on average of nearly 2,000 visits a month. The newest version of the website, developed in partnership with the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, went live in December 2022. Today, we're pleased to present our latest report, Global Biolabs 2023. This report provides more information on BSL4 labs, and it extends our scope to cover what are termed BSL3 plus or BSL3 enhanced labs. More about this very soon. In addition, the report provides national scorecards that we've developed to assess how well countries with BSL4 labs are doing on biosafety, biosecurity, and dual-use oversight. Finally, the report offers recommendations to labs, governments, and international organizations and networks for practical steps to strengthen biorisk management at the local, national, and global levels. The report is available for download from our website, globalbiolabs.org. Before we dive into the data, Greg and I want to introduce you to and to say a big thank you to the entire Global Biolabs team that has made this report possible. From King's College London, we would like to thank our research associates, Myra Amaneris and Haley Wingo. On the George Mason side, we'd like to recognize the work of biodefense students Brian Hauser and Rebecca Earnhardt. Joseph Rogers, who is also a PhD student at George Mason, is someone will be introduced to and hear more from a bit later on this call. Joseph is also an associate director and associate fellow at CSIS and a specific project on nuclear issues. With that, let me turn the mic over to Greg for an update on BSL4 labs and the new information we have on BSL3 enhanced labs. Over to you, Greg.
Thanks, Philippa. So we have now identified 69 BSL4 labs that are operational, under construction, or planned in 27 countries. This is an increase from of 10 labs that we identified back in 2021. All these newly identified labs are still in the planning stage. Of the 69 labs, most are in Europe, and then Asia and North America, and finally, there are small numbers in Australia, Africa, and South America. Of these 69 labs, 51 of them are currently operational. It's worth noting that about 75% of current and planned BSL4 labs are located in urban areas, which heightens concerns about accidents at these facilities. We define urban locations as those with a population of at least 50,000 people living within 2.5 miles of the lab. Next slide, please. The number of BSL4 labs around the world has been growing steadily over the last 2 decades. with 3/4 of all BSL4 labs having become operational since 2000. This initial building boom was due in large part to the anthrax letter attacks in 2001 and the SARS outbreak in 2003, which highlighted the threat posed by both natural and human-made outbreaks. The COVID-19 pandemic has led to another building boom for BSL4 labs. Since the start of the pandemic, 9 countries have announced plans to build 12 new BSL4 labs. For 5 of these countries, this will be their first BSL4 lab. Most of these new labs will be built in Asia, including in India, Kazakhstan, the Philippines, and Singapore. India alone has announced plans to build 4 more BSL4 labs in addition to the 2 they currently have. We've categorized these labs into 4 types: university-owned, defense, public health, and privately owned. About 60% of these BSL4 labs are government-run public health research institutions. Fewer than 20% of them are university labs, and fewer than 20% are defense labs. There are also 2 privately owned BSL4 labs. More than 80% of these labs focus their work on human health, 10% are focused on animals, and the rest conduct research on both human and animal health threats. We've also collected data on the characteristics of these BSL4 labs, and this is a new addition to our report from 2021. The most common method of primary containment used in these labs are positive pressure suits, where researchers work in self-contained spacesuits with their own air supply. The rest of these labs use biosafety cabinets to handle these pathogens safely. We've also identified more specialized versions of BSL4 labs that have specific biosafety requirements. We've identified 15 BSL4 labs that work with infected animals, which is called an ABSL4 lab. More than half of these labs are in the United States. Canada and China each have 2 of these ABSL4 labs, while Australia, Germany, and India each have 1 of these labs. There's probably not a complete count of ABSL4 labs, since it includes only labs that meet this standard, not those that actually conduct research with infected animals or have the capability to do so. Due to the difference in biosafety designations between different countries, there is no one common universal way to define these labs. Another 2 labs have special containment measures to work with infected arthropods, such as ticks. This is called an ACL4 lab. There's 1 of these in the United States and 1 in Australia. We also found that BSL4 labs vary greatly in the size of the lab space as well. Of the 46 labs that we have data for, 9 of these labs are over 1,000 square meters in size, 15 labs are between 200 and 1,000 square meters, and 22 labs are smaller than 200 square meters. In other words, about half the BSL4 labs are less than 200 square meters. That's less than the size of a tennis court. We also found that less than 1/6 of these BSL4 labs are these very large labs that are usually featured in media imagery of maximum containment laboratories. So the public perception of these labs is quite a bit different from the reality of how most of these labs are structured. A new addition to our project is a global inventory of BSL3 enhanced or BSL3 plus labs, as they're sometimes known. BSL3 enhanced labs have additional biosafety features compared to standard BSL3 labs. These might include showers, HEPA filters for exhaust air, and researchers wearing powered air purifying respirators to provide additional protection against aerosols and other respiratory infections. We've expanded our study to include these BSL3 enhanced labs, since these labs are used in some countries to study dangerous pathogens such as highly pathogenic avian influenza and the 1918 flu. In some cases, these labs are also used to enhance the virulence or transmissibility of a pathogen or create a potential pandemic pathogen, which is commonly known as gain-of-function research. We've located 57 labs that self-identify as BSL3 enhanced. Roughly 3/4 of these labs are based in Europe, which is 21, and in North America, which is 19. These labs are all operational, except for 1 in the United States that is under construction and 1 in Brazil that is planned. Identifying BSL3 enhanced labs is tricky, since there's no agreed upon international definition of what a BSL3 enhanced lab is. Moreover, there are a few national biosafety guidelines on what constitutes a BSL3 enhanced lab, and little to no research has been conducted that demonstrates that these enhancements actually provide an adequate level of additional safety for the riskier research that they're conducting in these laboratories. Finally, unlike for BSL4 labs, there's no requirement under the Biological Weapons Convention's confidence building measures to declare these labs or their activities. BSL3 enhanced labs are pretty evenly divided between being part of universities and being government-run public health labs, with about 40% of such labs in each category. In contrast, a much higher proportion of BSL4 labs are part of government-run public health research institutions. 1/4 of the BSL3 enhanced labs focus their work on animal health, which is a high proportion of BSL4 labs. About half of BSL3 enhanced labs deal exclusively with threats to human health, which is a much lower percentage compared to the BSL4 labs. And the remainder of the BSL3 enhanced labs conduct work that is relevant to both human and animal health. 80% of BSL3 enhanced labs are located in urban areas, which is a higher proportion than for BSL4 labs. Overall, when you add up the number of BSL4 and BSL3 enhanced labs, there are well over 100 biomedical research facilities that conduct high consequential research around the world, with more planned and under construction. Europe is home to about half of these operational labs, while a third are located in North America and 1/6 located in Asia. In terms of future labs, most of them will be built in Asia, with 11 BSL4 labs planned or under construction in that part of the world. While COVID-19 demonstrated that no country is safe from a pandemic and that all countries need a strong public health infrastructure, it's important to ensure that pandemic preparedness activities are carried out safely, securely, and responsibly everywhere. This leads to the next new element of our initiative, which examines the strength of biosafety and biosecurity and dual-use governance in each of the countries that has or plans to have a BSL4 lab. And Philippa will be able to tell you all about that.
Thanks, Greg. So I'll spend a few minutes telling you about the scorecards that we've developed. After I've done that, I'll hand over to Joseph, who'll give you a little demonstration of the map and the sort of information that's available on there. And then finally, we'll come back to Greg, who will give a bit of the set of recommendations that we want to highlight as coming out of the data that we've collected. So in terms of measuring biorisk governance, we've developed 2 new ways to measure the ability of a country to safely, securely, and responsibly operate high-consequence biomedical research facilities. The first assesses the breadth and the depth of a country's approach to biorisk management, and for us, that includes biosafety, biosecurity, and dual-use research oversight. And this approach is based on original research that's been conducted by the Global Biolab team. The second method assesses a country's national context in terms of its general governance and stability beyond biorisk management. And that index or that assessment is based on a collation of pre-existing indices. So that's not original data that we've collected ourselves, but we've analyzed that data to fit within the context of this particular research. First, let's focus on biorisk management. So in a major report that was released last year, the WHO endorsed biorisk management as an overarching concept for ensuring the responsible use of the life sciences. Our scorecards are designed to provide concrete, quantifiable indicators of how well countries are implementing this concept. So we've developed 3 scorecards, one on biosafety, one on biosecurity, and one on dual use. And when you combine them, you then get the overall biorisk management score. For each of the biosafety, biosecurity, and dual use scorecards, we've developed a set of metrics that we use to score each country. The metrics are ones that we've collated from different international standards, and you see them listed there on the slide. We've also added a few of our own, particularly around levels of participation in international engagement, obviously related to biorisk management. So we've added this to ones that we've already got to get what we consider to be appropriate standards. All our data is based on open sources. We primarily focused on whether or not the metrics were embedded in legally binding or statutory legislation, regulations, and policies. Documents that provide guidance or best practices have not been counted. So that gives you a little bit of the kind of the methodology we've adopted. Let's have a quick look at the scorecards themselves, what they look like. Overall, the biorisk management scorecard grades countries on 41 distinct metrics. 18 of these were for biosafety, which you can see here. So these include measures to prevent lab-acquired infections and the accidental release of a pathogen from a lab. Countries could earn a total of 20 points for biosafety based on these 18 metrics. We also had 18 metrics for biosecurity, which includes, they're not the same metrics. They include measures to prevent the theft, misuse, or deliberate release of a biological agent from a lab. And countries could score a total of 18 points for biosecurity. And for dual use, we had 5 metrics, which measures how well countries oversee research that could generate materials or knowledge that could be misused to cause harm. Countries could score a total of 10 points in this category. We didn't score all countries in the world. We only scored the 27 countries that have or plan to have BSL4 labs. We then placed them in rankings of high, medium, and low. I want to emphasize that these scores are based primarily on whether a country has laws, regulations in place that address the metric on our list. Our score cannot and should not be interpreted as evaluating how comprehensively or how rigorously a country is actually implementing those laws and regulations, or indeed the level of compliance by labs on their territory. On the flip side, since our scores are based on national governance measures, they can't capture biorisk management policies at lower levels of governments or policies and practices within the individual labs that are more stringent than national laws and regulations. So there are these caveats to the data we've collected here, and we do think it's important to emphasize that. So 21 out of the 27 countries score high on biosafety governance. 6 countries score medium or low on biosafety. Countries that score high on biosafety have national legislation, they have a national oversight entity, and a national list of dangerous pathogens. Among biosafety implementation measures, the biggest gap was in inventory requirements, followed by PPE requirements, so personal protective equipment. Globally, we're doing less well on biosecurity. Only 12 countries score high here, with 9 countries scoring medium and 6 low. The biggest gap here was in screening DNA orders for sequences related to dangerous pathogens. Only 2 countries, the US and France, have policies on this. Only 11 countries include cybersecurity in their biosecurity requirements, and only 12 countries mandate biosecurity risk assessments. The picture is even worse for governance of dual-use research. Only 1 country, Canada, scored high. 2 others, the United States and the UK, score medium, and the rest really score low. And many of these countries receive a score of 0. Only 1 country, Canada, has national dual-use research legislation. 2 countries have entities with national oversight responsibilities. These are Canada and Taiwan. And 3 countries have funding agency review processes, they include the US, the UK, and Germany. Only 3 countries have national awareness raising measures, and 11 countries have stakeholders where they've adopted self-governance measures. So let's look at the overall scores. When we add biosafety, biosecurity, and dual-use research oversight together, 7 countries score high on biorisk management, 15 countries score medium, and 5 score low. There are, of course, many things that we can read into these scores, but the one thing that we want to highlight is that several of the countries building new labs, some for the very first time, and these are the ones that are listed on there in bold, they score poorly on biorisk management. The sort of glimmer of hope, however, is that since these labs aren't built yet, there's still time to strengthen national laws and regulation on biosafety, biosecurity, and dual use to bring them up to national standards. And we're hoping that our data and our recommendations will nudge or encourage countries to do so. Right. The National Biorisk Management Scorecards provide a snapshot of the status of national legislation and regulation, but they don't provide evidence of how well these measures are being complied with or enforced, as I already mentioned. So to provide a general sense of the ability of countries with BSL4 labs to effectively implement their biorisk management policies, we created 2 indexes. These form the second set of scorecards that I mentioned. So one index measures the quality of governance in a country, and the other measures the level of stability. These indexes are based on data generated by the World Bank, by Transparency International, by Freedom House, by the Nuclear Threat Initiative, by Fund for Peace, and others. We combined the scores that countries received from each of these sources to create a composite score indicating how well governed and how stable the country is. You can find more details about our methodology on our website, and we're also happy to take questions should you have any on that. The governance and stability scores were usually consistent, with only 4 countries yielding a discrepancy greater than 20 points between the 2 indexes. Most existing BSL4 labs are located in countries that are relatively well-governed and stable. However, most of the planned BSL4 labs are to be built in countries that scored below average for both governance and stability. And this raises serious questions about the ability of these countries to effectively implement national biorisk management policies. We also calculated the average of the governance and stability percentile scores for each country and named this average score the national context. This score was then plotted against the overall biorisk management scores to create a scatter plot. As you would expect, most countries with high biorisk management scores also had high national context scores, as you can see in the upper right quadrant. Among the countries in the bottom left quadrant with lower scores for both categories, there are a combined 7 planned BSL4 labs and 5 operating BSL4 labs. It's also worth noting the number of countries that have relatively good biorisk management scores, but score below the 50th percentile on national context, which raises questions about the ability of those countries to properly implement and enforce their biosafety and biosecurity governance measures. In a moment, Greg will present our recommendations to you, but before he does so, as I mentioned at the start, Joseph will give a brief demonstration of our map and give you a quick look at our website to see the sorts of resources that are available there. So over to you, Joseph.
Hi there, I'm Joseph Rogers, and I'm going to briefly do a walkthrough of a few aspects of our new revamped website. First, I'll walk through how the map works by demonstrating some lab entries within the map. And then I'll highlight just a few interactive resources that we have also on the globalbiolabs.org website. So when you first appear at globalbiolabs.org, this is our sort of home screen. There's 2 different ways that you can access our map. One is by clicking map on the top right over here, or just zooming down a little bit and hitting explore our map. So when you click that, it'll take you to our map right here. And when you first appear on the map, you're going to have a satellite view of the entire world here. So the most important thing when you first appear here is this little toggle icon on the left-hand side. If you click this button, it can go away, so don't lose it. And over here, you'll see that you can switch between satellite, light base map, or dark base map. Which might just help you see some of the entries a little bit better. Additionally, you can filter by lab type, so you can only select BSL4 labs, you can select BSL3 labs, 3 enhanced labs, animal BSL4 labs, or arthropod, the containment level 4 labs. It's also important to note that you can have multiple lab types on at the same time. So if you see something that shouldn't be there, then you might have an extra toggle on simultaneously. Additionally, you can use our scorecards to filter the world based off of the biosafety, biosecurity, dual use, governance, and stability scores. However, since these are color coded, you can't have multiple of these layers on at the same time. And also, if you want to be able to see these color coded maps, it sometimes helps to switch to the light or dark rather than the satellite imagery. So I'm going to quickly walk through a few examples of some lab entries just to show you what the sort of data we have is. And first, we're going to start with a lab in Germany, a BSL4 lab. So I'm going to toggle BSL4s to have all of the BSL4s appear. I could zoom in on Germany, but I could also hit zoom to a specific country, go down here and go to Germany. And now all of the sort of labs that are nearby appear here. So we're going to look at the Bernard Nocht Institute. So when you click on the bubble, it'll bring you into the satellite image of the lab. And then on the right-hand side over here, you'll see a whole bunch of new information about that lab that is listed over here. You can also lose this information by clicking this toggle. So you might need to toggle it out if it vanishes. So this is all of the information that we have about the different labs. We list the address, the country, the institutional affiliation, the status, whether it's like operational, planned, or under construction, a link to the website. If available, we link to the publications. We have the latitude and longitude, the sort of containment type, whether it's an animal BSL4 as well as a BSL4, an arthropod containment. What type of containment is inside of the lab if we have that data. So it could be a glove box, a suit, or both. The date that we think the lab went operational was expected or will be announced for sort of planned labs. The research focus, which is human or animal or both. The size where available. The type of lab, which is either public health, university, defense, or in a few cases private. Whether the lab is urban, located within 2.5 miles of 50,000 people, and the type of lab. So that's the Bernard Nocht Institute. I'm going to walk through a few other examples of the different types of labs, just to sort of give you a flavor for what other data is available. So when you click on this base map right here, it'll zoom all the way out to the whole world. And we're going to look at a level 3 enhanced lab in South Korea. So we're going to zoom down to the Republic of Korea. And right now, the 3 enhanced lab is not showing up. So you need to toggle 3+. And just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to get rid of the 4. We're going to click on the Republic of Korea International Vaccine Institute. And so here you'll see all of the same information about this lab listed over here. And notably, this is a 3 enhanced lab, and it's a university run lab, whereas the previous lab was a sort of public health institute. And this is sort of highlights one of our findings that many more of the BSL3 enhanced labs are university ran than the sort of proportion of BSL4 labs, which about 3/4 of the BSL4 labs that we identified were public health labs. About half of the BSL3s are university run. So this is the sort of BSL3 lab. So let's zoom back out. We're going to go to the animal BSL4 labs. And we're going to look at the National Center for Foreign Animal Diseases in Canada. So I could use the zoom, or I can just kind of zoom into Canada. And I click on that. And it brings me to all of the same information about the lab. And notably, this is an animal BSL4 lab. So it's checked here. Also, since it's a BSL4 as well, you'll see that it is listed under the BSL4 there. And lastly, we're going to look at the arthropod containment level 4 labs, and we're going to look at Galveston. And when we zoom here, you'll see that if you follow the little tick icon, then the lab is listed here, and the same information is listed as well. And there are sort of 2 BSL4s that we list right next to the Galveston arthropod containment level 4 lab. So that's overall how the map works. In addition to the map on our website, there's a number of other interesting resources that I hope are worthwhile. You can access one interactive graphic of a BSL4 under resources by clicking interactive. It'll bring you to this sort of educational resource about what it's like to work in a containment level 4 lab. If you click these little icons, then there's a little bit of information that pops up. We also were able to add some videos from the the Robert Koch Institute, who let us kindly post their videos on our interactive. So you can also access those videos about what it's like to manage waste in a BSL4 lab, exit the lab. They're also listed under resources videos. And in addition to that, we have a list of biorisk management memos, which you might hear a little bit more about in a minute. You can access these resources that kind of explain sort of biorisk management networks. And there's a whole bunch listed here, so you can download them and reach out. If you have any questions, you can always contact the Global Biolabs team with the Contact Us button, which will send an email to the Global Biolabs email. So that's kind of how the website works. And with that, I will pass it over to Dr. Koblenz.
Thanks, Joseph. So we have several recommendations coming out of the study and our work in this area more broadly to address the variety of risks posed by working with dangerous pathogens. These recommendations are applicable to laboratories, national governments, and international organizations. At the laboratory level, our primary recommendation is for labs to adopt ISO 35001, which is the international standard for biorisk management that's been in the book since 2019. Rather than focusing on specific biosafety and biosecurity practices, the standard promotes the adoption of a management system that prioritizes biosafety and biosecurity and provides incentives for continual improvement in these areas in terms of the practices and processes in place to ensure safe and secure operations of the laboratory. This standard is compatible with all national biosafety and biosecurity laws and regulations, so its adoption really is low-hanging fruit that would help labs make sure that they're operating in accordance with the highest international standards. At the national level, all countries with high consequence research facilities, both BSL4, BSL3 enhanced, and other labs that are working with dangerous pathogens should have whole of government biorisk management systems in place, including comprehensive legislation covering biosafety, biosecurity, and dual-use research oversight, and a national entity with jurisdiction over both public and private facilities that can enforce compliance with these regulations. Another gap is the lack of national standards for field biosafety, protect researchers while collecting biomedical samples from live animals. There are basically no national standards that we're aware of or international standards for that matter. And so this is an area that requires more development to make sure that researchers in the field are operating with the best practices and the best possible protections against infection. Countries without a national biosafety association are encouraged to support the creation of one by biosafety and biosecurity professionals in their country as a way to increase the professionalization of those areas and share best practices and again ensure that labs have access to highly trained and qualified individuals to oversee biosafety and biosecurity operations. States with high consequence research facilities should also be submitting confidence building measures, declarations to the Biological Weapons Convention and making these public. And that would really help improve transparency. And of course, all of these countries should be fully implementing UN Security Council Resolution 1540, which is designed to prevent non-state actors from getting access to biological materials or technology that they could use to cause harm. Let me take a minute to talk about our recommendations for enhancing global governance of biorisks. There are two types of actors that engage in biorisk management at the international level. The first type are multilateral institutions like the WHO, the World Organization for Animal Health, and the Biological Weapons Convention. The second type are informal groups and networks like the International Experts Group of Biosafety and Biosecurity Regulators, the Global Health Security Agenda, the Global Partnerships Biological Security Working Group, and the International Federation of Biosafety Associations. Generally speaking, the international organizations with more inclusive membership and greater resources place biorisk management lower down on the list of priorities. The groups that are more focused on biorisk management in their missions tend to have more limited memberships, authorities, and resources to mandate meaningful changes at the national, international level. We've produced a series of memos on many of these organizations to provide a deeper understanding of the international actors working on biorisk management, and these can be found on our website, as Joseph already mentioned. Next slide. So we advocate a two-pronged approach to improving global governance of biorisk management. The first approach is multilateral. Since the WHO and the Biological Weapons Convention are the bulwarks of global health and the biological weapons arms control regimes, there's more that these institutions can be doing to strengthen global biorisk management. We have 4 recommendations for the WHO. First, they should develop evidence-based international guidance for BSL3 enhanced labs to ensure that the safety measures used by these labs are commensurate with the risks posed by the research they are conducting. Second, WHO should lead an international effort to develop guidance for field biosafety and integrate that guidance into the next edition of their laboratory biosafety manual, which is the basically international Bible for biosafety for many countries. Third, the WHO should establish collaborating centers for biorisk management in all 6 WHO regions to provide a hub for biosafety and biosecurity research, education, training, and capacity building. And finally, the World Health Assembly should pass a resolution requiring annual progress reports from the Director General on the steps taken by the WHO to strengthen biorisk management among its member states. The Biological Weapons Convention can also play an important role in improving transparency around high consequence labs by adding a requirement to the confidence building measures that states declare any BSL3 enhanced labs on their territory, as well as whatever legislation, regulations, or other measures they've put in place to provide oversight for dual use research. However, our assessment is that today's biological threats are too diverse, too urgent, and too complex to be addressed solely by traditional multilateral forums like the WHO and the Biological Weapons Convention. While these treaty-based international organizations have long been the gold standard for international cooperation, they can take years to negotiate, are difficult to modify, and are easily held hostage by geopolitics. In the short, medium term, we advocate pursuing a mini-lateral strategy for strengthening global biorisk management that capitalizes on existing informal groups and networks. Minilateralism is a collective action strategy that brings together the smallest number of countries that can have the greatest impact on an issue. Minilateralism seeks to create a coalition of the willing with the capability and motivation to take substantive actions that multilateral institutions cannot or will not undertake because of either political, legal, or resource constraints. By starting with a small core group of dedicated states, such a coalition can reach agreements on shared objectives much more quickly and avoid problems posed by spoiler states or lowest common denominator outcomes, which are common in multilateral negotiations. Minilateral initiatives can pursue many goals, including information sharing, standard setting, policy coordination, capacity building, and confidence building. So these types of minilateral initiatives can be quite flexible. As progress is made, these initiatives can expand in scope, raise their standards, and invite new members to join. It's important to emphasize that these minilateral groups complement, do not replace, multilateral regimes such as the WHO and the Biological Weapons Convention. So specifically, we propose leveraging the informal groups and networks on biorisk management that currently exist to advance the widespread adoption of the international standard for biorisk management known as ISO 35001. And each of the existing minilateral groups can better integrate implementation of that standard into their missions. So for example, the International Federation of Biosafety Associations could offer education and training opportunities to lab managers on how to implement ISO 35001. The Global Health Security Agenda and the Biosecurity Working Group of the Global Partnership could organize and coordinate funding for projects to help labs in low-income countries adopt this standard. Labs that participate in the BSL4 ZNet and the EHRNA research network could become test beds by adopting ISO 35001 and developing guidance on how to implement the standard and share best practices with other labs outside the network. The labs in these networks could also develop standards and codes of conduct based on international guidance, such as that in the World Health Organization's Global Guidance Framework for Responsible Use of Life Sciences, the World Organization Animal Health guidelines for responsible conduct in veterinary research, and the Tianjin biosecurity guidelines for codes of conduct for scientists. So there's opportunity for labs that already have well-established biosafety and biosecurity systems to advance the field by developing new codes of conduct, new standards that they can then share with other labs who can emulate or adopt those standards for their own purposes. Now, to maximize the potential of ISO 35001, which, like all ISO standards, is designed to be validated by an outside entity, there should be some sort of international mechanism to ensure compliance with the standard. Given its regulatory expertise, we recommend that the international experts group of biosafety and biosecurity regulators could take on this mission of auditing laboratory compliance with ISO 35001 using a peer review model. Peer review is the systematic evaluation of the performance of a state by other states for the purpose of helping the reviewed state improve its policies and practices and comply with established international standards. This type of peer review is already widely used in the international oversight of nuclear safety and nuclear security, and it's been tested by several members of the Biological Weapons Convention as a means of building confidence in the treaty and improving national implementation. And we think this combination of international compliance, auditing, and using a peer review method would provide a relatively low-cost and practical way to ensure and provide confidence that states that adopt this biorisk management standard are implementing it effectively. A coordinated approach to enhancing global biorisk management that harnesses these informal groups and reinforces the measures adopted by multilateral institutions would have a powerful synergistic effect. Given the growth we've seen in BSL4 labs to date, and the expectation that we will probably see even more labs grow in number, both BSL4s and BSL3 enhanced labs, we need to ensure that global biorisk management standards are keeping up with the growth in these laboratories. So thank you all very much for your attention. Please check out our website at globalbiolabs.org, where you can find our report, the memos on these different organizations, our other articles that we've published on issues related to biosafety and biosecurity, and other resources that you can use to educate yourself about these laboratories, about biosafety, about biosecurity, and dual-use research oversight. We also welcome you to contact us via email through the Contact Us button on the bottom if you have additional questions or other information that you think would help improve our lab, our map, since we're always looking to make sure it is as accurate as possible. And then finally, we welcome your questions, so please use the Q&A function to submit any questions you have, and Philippe and I will be happy to answer those questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. I think we've already got a few questions in the box. So as Greg said, we do have a few minutes to answer questions, and we're very pleased to engage with you. There are already, as I mentioned, a few questions in the chat there. So the first of these is around this category of BSL3+, asking us to be a little bit more specific about what we mean by BSL3+, and we didn't really define it very well in this presentation. There's more information in the report that we've now launched. It should be have gone up on our website as we started the webinar. Essentially, there are 4 categories of containment: BSL1, 2, 3, and 4. But what we've noticed over the last few years is that some labs are wanting to do slightly riskier research, and in order to do that, they need higher containment. But the research doesn't necessarily require you to go up an entire level. So this generally happens at BSL3 labs. There are many, many, many BSL3 labs around the world. Too many for us to manually map, at least with the resources we currently have. But what we've done is, or what some of these labs are doing, is adding some safety features, which then enable them to work at, or to call themselves a BSL3 plus, and and that enables them to do that slightly riskier research. It's generally about not the particular pathogen that they're working with, but with the kind of research activity that they're doing with that particular pathogen. So there's very little national biosafety guidance and absolutely no international guidance really on what constitutes a BSL3 plus lab. And there's also very little research demonstrating that these enhancements provide an adequate level of additional safety for the riskier research that's conducted in these labs. So it's an area where we're seeing increasing numbers of labs doing this. The labs that we've mapped are all labs that have self-identified as BSL3 plus or BSL3 enhanced labs, without there really being, an official and formal defined standard or category of what that actually is. So it is a trend that we're seeing and that we're wanting to highlight, and suggesting that more attention needs to be paid to this. In terms of other questions, there's a question from Todd Kuchen. Hi, Todd. Great to have you with us. Todd asks, could you talk about the features that are missing from BSL3 plus compared to a BSL4? So what are the sorts of things that you have at a BSL3 versus BSL4? So you would add some things to a BSL3 plus, but they still remain at a BSL3. And perhaps I might bring in Myra here to highlight some of the different features between a BSL3 and a BSL4. Myra?
Hello, can you hear me? So, some of the things, as Felipe was explaining, for the purposes of this presentation, we couldn't explain all the things that we did on the research. So to expand on this point, we define the BSL3 labs and the difference they have between BSL3 labs and BSL3 plus labs. So all of this, the difference will be that they have additional features, and all of this is defined on our report that you can find on the website. In general, work conducted in a BSL3 plus level would usually involve work with biological agents that would normally be conducted in a BSL3 lab, but there are certain types of pathogens, for example, high containment, highly pathogenic avian influenza, the 1918 pandemic influenza also, that has, for example, more risky to be, be shared in the community. That's something that can happen in the community. So if we are working with avian influenza and 1918 pandemic influenza, we will conduct that research in a BSL3 plus lab. And another thing would be, for example, certain types of practices, for example, even higher than the normal volume of the samples involved that you're using in a BSL3 lab, higher concentrations of cultures, for example, and a practice that is in using and in doing increasing production of aerosols. So whenever we have these kind of practices on these kind of samples, we will choose to use a BSL3 plus lab. So international guidance don't define BSL3 plus lab. We are always in 1, 2, 3, 4 labs, but this is something that we will see that, for example, the US and other guidance are requiring to have BSL3 labs. Another examples of enhancement that BSL3 lab can have include some additional trainings for staff, more rigorous emergency response plans, enhanced respiratory protection against aerosols for personnel, and more rigorous adherence to, for example, respiratory protection or clothing change protocols, HEPA filtration and dedicated exhaust air from the lab, and pass-through autoclaves. Another thing would be lab effluent contamination, personal body shower prior exiting the laboratory, and strengthen all the controls that we will have as biosecurity measures, as access controls and monitoring. And then comparing BSL3 plus labs with BSL4 labs, the difference will be additional containment measures as research conducted in BSL4 labs involve more risky pathogens. So laboratories working with this type of pathogens in a BSL lab with pathogens that are more dangerous and exotic that will pose more like higher risk to individual risk and life-threatening diseases that may be transmitted via aerosol route or that which will have no available vaccine or therapy. So that's the difference between BSL3 plus labs and BSL4 labs. And there will be some other features in the lab that we will have, for example, biosafety cabinets. You will have biosafety cabinets level 2 in a that we can use in a level 3 plus. And in a level 3, in level 4 lab, you will have, for example, biosafety cabinets that will be number 3. And another thing would be like complete suits that you will find in a BSL4 that they are not required in a BSL3 plus lab.
Thank you so much, Myra. That was a wonderfully comprehensive answer. And I think Todd must have no more questions about the features of the different labs. We've had in a lot of new questions. We've got about 20 questions. I'll go ahead and answer a couple more to give you a breather, Greg, and then I'll turn over to you to answer a few of the other ones. So there was one question from an anonymous questioner asking any future chance of the site of our website incorporating near real-time self-reported or government reported BSL or accidents or incidents, biosafety incidents. We're not looking at incidents currently for our website. It would be very difficult to incorporate that kind of information. There are very few public sources with either real-time or past data on lab incidents. I think that's one of the things we should be pushing for is more transparency in incidents so we get a good sense of what the general base rate is. The vast majority of incidents in labs don't result in infections or any major consequences. But of course, there are incidents all the time, and it would be a good to get a sense of what that sort of normal base rate of regular incidents are. So then we could aggregate that data and see, well, what are the most common types, how often do they happen, and how do we then respond to those? So I agree with your sentiment that it's important to highlight accidents and incidents and normalize it and not stigmatize it. I mean, labs should be rewarded for being open about incident rates, et cetera, as a way of improving our responses to them and reducing them. But in terms of getting any data on that, that is very difficult. Institutions don't necessarily report it. It might just be within the institution. What then gets reported to regulators might not then be passed on to the public, et cetera. And of course, all of this varies from country to country as well. A second question also from someone anonymous is any idea as to what the year-over-year growth rate in BSL3 and 4 is for each region? So the bulk of maximum containment facilities has traditionally been based in Europe and in North America. What we are now seeing, particularly post-pandemic, or at least coming out of the pandemic, is the rise of BSL4 labs being planned in the Asia region. And I think that's pretty much as broad as we can are able to we can't give you many more specifics than that. That's about the right level. So Greg, over to you. There's a few more for you to answer, I think.
Sure. So there's a question from Alberto Aparicio. Are you aware of initiatives studying biosafety or biosecurity policies from a sociological or STS point of view? There is a limited amount of kind of social science research being done on biosafety and biosecurity, but most of the research in this field is fairly technical. The area where we see the most interest from social scientists is looking either at kind of the culture of safety and security and responsible research, and then looking at human practices and the extent to which human error plays a role in biosafety and biosecurity. But this is definitely an area that needs a lot more research and has not really gotten the attention it deserves. So I think this is an area where definitely more work needs to be done. And if you have particular interest in this area, please contact us via the website, and we can have a follow-up conversation about it. there's a question from Anonymous about whether the Global Biolab study looks at the practices of truth-making or manipulation about controversies such as the COVID-19 origins. We don't address that issue within our project. However, Philippa has a separate project running out of King's College that looks at disinformation related to biological weapons and how to counter that disinformation. So maybe she could pop her website into the chat, and that would be a great resource for those of you who are interested in that issue, which is highly important. And I will just say though that our project, even though we don't tackle these issues directly, right, our goal is to provide better information to policymakers and the public so they are better informed and that they will be able to find information that is not biased and will enable them to sort out what is true and what is misinformation, because there's a lot of misinformation out there especially about BSL4 level laboratories, because they tend to be sensationalized and otherwise kind of misunderstood. There's a question here from James about new private labs in Nigeria that are popping up without any monitoring and certification, and it's difficult to classify them and the level of risk they pose. So this sounds like Nigeria needs a national legislation and an entity to maintain a registry of such labs. As we noted, there are a growing number of these labs in the private sector, and this is an area where governments typically haven't had as much oversight. They tend to focus on labs that are either run by the government or funded by the government, but private sector labs are increasingly important. So we definitely would like to see more countries adopt biorisk management governance that looks at both publicly and privately funded labs. So this would definitely be an area to look into.
Should I go?
I'll tackle. Sorry, you want to go next?
If you have one more, you go for it.
I'll do one more. There's a question from Heather Sheely about biosafety associations that operate in education and awareness area. These should be recognized. Totally agree. We're focused on biosafety associations operating in countries that have BSL4 labs, but obviously there are many, many more countries out there that also have biosafety associations. Some of them are national, some of them are regional, and we definitely think these are great resources that need to be better supported in order to ensure that the biosecurity professionals have the knowledge and training and skills they need to properly oversee research happening in these laboratories. And that's an area that has gotten more attention of late, but really is a great kind of underutilized resource that we'd like to see a lot more investment in.
Thanks, Greg. I'll let you catch your breath while I tackle a few more. There's a question from Gabby Essex, who asks whether we've engaged with the facilities when conducting our research, presumably whether we've been engaging with labs. And if we did engage with labs, how much engagement did we receive, or did we receive pushback on the project? Well, I think one of the important things is definitely to engage with labs. Both Greg and I do engage regularly with labs, have been inside the labs. Just last week, I was in Norway and got a tour of one of the labs there. So engagement is incredibly important. When we initially started mapping all our labs, we did contact all of the labs that we were mapping, saying, this is the information we hold on you. This is our project. This is what we intend to do with the information. Please look at it. Please correct it if it's wrong, etc. And a fair few labs did respond. A fair few labs didn't respond to our requests. Some of these were, of course, with people who didn't know us. I think there was, understandably, a fair bit of uncertainty at the beginning. What were we intending to do with this project? What was our motive, etc.? And so some labs would sit on the fence in terms of engagement. I think now it's becoming more clear what our intent has been. You know, our intent is most definitely not to sort of name and shame labs. This is definitely an effort of trying to increase biosafety, biosecurity, dual use oversight across the globe, because this is an issue that we think is incredibly important and one that we care passionately about. And so I think engagement has increased actually over time. And so yes, that's how I would answer that question. There was a second question on peer reviews, actually, saying in the nuclear side, the IAEA, so the nuclear watchdog, hosts working groups and facilitates peer reviews. What, if any, organization would facilitate this for biosafety and biosecurity? And of course, for biosafety and security, we don't have an IAEA on the bio side. We don't have an OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, on the bio side. So we don't have this kind of international organization with a mandate to inspect premises, labs, or to facilitate engagement between an international organization and labs, or from lab to lab. So it's a good question to ask. Well, so who would be the obvious one? Well, as I mentioned at the start, I'm currently speaking to you from the UN on the margins of a meeting of Biological Weapons Convention states. The Biological Weapons Convention members do themselves organize peer reviews. These peer reviews are very much focused on within the security frame, but also focus on biosafety, and they do organize exchanges between labs in different countries where you would go and visit. You would hear about their laws and regulations around biosafety and biosecurity. You'd visit the premises, you'd engage with the people there. And that is a way of facilitating these kind of peer reviews, if you like. I've been along to a few of these, and they're always really well received. And I think people generally enjoy the exchanges, and there is some real sharing of good practice between the labs. Just across the road from where I am is the WHO. The WHO is another, I suppose, obvious candidate, which also to some extent organizes peer reviews. Some of these are more formal, others are less formal. So for instance, under the for the variola virus, so the virus that causes smallpox, which is kept at which is formally only kept at 2 facilities in the world. The WHO sort of acts as a coordinator of international experts visiting both of these places, inspecting them. This is a little bit more formal than what's done currently under the Biological Weapons Convention. But again, that would form another sort of model where you get the expertise in from different countries, and you have an international organization like the WHO who acts as the coordinator and facilitator of those peer reviews. Finally, I have one more question that I wanted to answer, simply because I'm here and talking about the BWC and observing the diplomats negotiating what's the agenda of what's to come for the next few years. There's a question that says, we've not mentioned progress to ratification of UN member states of the BWC. So the BWC, this is kind of a nice question to answer, actually, because the BWC is not yet universal. There's about 10 countries in the world that haven't signed up to the Biological Weapons Convention yet. But we've just had a recent new member of the Biological Weapons Convention, bringing the total number of states parties up to 184. So there are a number of, the vast majority of countries in the world have signed up and ratified the Biological Weapons Convention. And there's a few stragglers, and everyone's trying to encourage them to join as well. And there is slow but steady progress towards that. So we'll keep working on that. Greg, over to you.
Thanks. So there are a couple of questions here that relate to as Dr. Sengupta put it, the information hazard created by putting information locations of these labs on the website, and a couple others who had similar concerns. All this information is publicly available. It's open source. And so the location of these labs are all known, and most of these labs have websites that have their address and that sort of thing. So from a security perspective, right, we don't see that as being a particular concern. We do not list certain information, right, such as the actual pathogens being studied in these labs. But again, that information is publicly known for a lot of these facilities, but we don't share that. And we think there's a value to aggregating this data because it does let us do, for example, show that figure of showing that the growth in BSL4 labs over time, which is important to understand what this trend looks like. That chart, the table we have that looks at the global distribution of these laboratories is also important because it helps you understand which regions are planning on building up capacity in this area. And then obviously we've connected that to our assessments of their biosafety and biosecurity governance and identified areas where there's a concern because there are countries that have, planned labs, maybe it's their first maximum containment laboratory, and yet they score very low on biosafety or biosecurity, or their national context indicates they might not have a robust capacity to implement these regulations, even if they're on the books. So we want to use this information to highlight areas that need strengthening and to help guide policymakers in terms of prioritizing what areas need investment, and also help the public understand the nature of these labs and where they are, where they're growing and the nature of them. So we have taken these things in consideration, but we think overall, right, the benefits of the transparency and the value of this information outweighs any marginal security risks that might be created by aggregating the data into one site. And there's also a couple of questions about kind of where we got the data from. Again, it's open source data, whether it's from the website of the laboratories themselves, from the articles that they're publishing, from the publicly available declarations that the countries made to the Biological Weapons Convention. There's actually quite a lot of data out there if you know where to look for it, and if you have a great team of researchers who know how to find it and collate it and analyze it, which is what we have. There was a comment from Jonathan Eubank from IHRNA about some members of that network not having been contacted. One issue we have had is finding the right contact information for these labs, since sometimes there's only a generic email address, and we've definitely run into problems where the email goes to a receptionist or a low-level person who just isn't equipped or able to answer or just ignores it. So we'll definitely try and do a better job next time, and hopefully labs that were not contacted or not aware of being contacted and they want to correct the information that we have posted, they are free to contact us at the email address on our website. And again, we are striving to have as much accurate information on the website as possible. So to the extent that people are aware of new labs, someone mentioned here, there's another BSL3 plus Argentina that maybe we missed. We'll have to look into that. If there are other labs that we've not identified, we're happy to add those. And if there are labs that we have in here, but someone wants to update the information from the laboratory, we welcome those kind of contacts as well. So again, please send us an email to the address on our globalbiolabs.org website.
There's a question here from David Malone. Hello, David. Good to have you with us. He says, thinking of the U.S. Navy BSL4 lab in Sierra Leone, whose regulation would it be governed by, the U.S. or Sierra Leone? Is this sort of building labs in a client state a loophole? So David, there are no U.S. BSL4 labs in Sierra Leone. The U.S. doesn't have its own BSL4 labs in other countries. They operate under national law in those countries. So the US, through its defense reduction, threat reduction program, has supported the building of a number of labs in countries. That is not so that they have their own research facilities in other countries. It's to support the local infrastructure in a safe and secure way. And so those labs would all go under national laws and regulations. Of course, you do have issues, and we do at King's as well, for example, when we have exchanges with other countries. We have people coming into our labs or our social science research projects even, whose legal frameworks do they fall under, whose risk assessments, et cetera, et cetera. And in those cases, you have to abide by the local standards, but you may apply additional standards, being the funder or the institution who's lent a researcher to someone else, et cetera. So there isn't actually a loophole at all, and but it is a good question to be raising, because it does indicate, I think, that there are these questions around governance, and it's important to clarify it and to be open about where that there are differences in standards between institutions, and that's, I think, precisely why there should be cooperation, assistance, exchanges, peer reviews, so that we can get to this kind of international standard of what we are expecting. Heather Sheely, you had a question, or you drew our attention to the fact that the WH Biosafety, the most recent biosafety manual, deliberately moved away from categories, so BSL 1, 2, 3, 4, to more risk-based assessments of which containment level is appropriate. So you moved away from lists. So if you're working with this particular pathogen, you would work at this containment level. If you're working with this riskier, more dangerous pathogen, you would work at a higher risk or a containment level. So they're moving away from that, in the sense that now you look at the pathogen, but you also look at what experiment you're doing with that pathogen, or what activity you're doing with that pathogen, because that might then bump it up into a different containment level. And I think that's absolutely the right way to go. It is important to consider the kind of experiment or the kind of activity that's being done with a pathogen, because that could make the experiment riskier than simply the general containment risk group or the containment level that it would have. So yes, this is a relatively new thing, and it's still being rolled out, and it sort of came out in the middle of the pandemic, and or at the very beginning of the pandemic, and it hasn't really been adopted and absorbed just yet. But the WHO is certainly socializing this. So so thanks for raising that and letting us speak to that. Greg.
Sure. So there was a question from Renan J. Kanoy about asking us to discuss our methods for how we scored the countries on biosafety, biosecurity, duties, research, oversight. And so for those scores are based on whether or not those countries have national governance measures in these areas. So do they have laws and regulations related to biosafety, biosecurity, duties, research, oversight, and do those laws contain the different metrics that we use to judge how kind of comprehensive those laws and regulations are. So it's very much based on what is published by those countries in terms of their governance measures. It does not capture policies at the laboratory level that might be stricter or higher than what's at the national level. But for the purposes of evaluating national biorisk management, right, we had to look at measures at the national level. Things that are kind of voluntary or guidance, we do not count. We're looking primarily at statutory, legally binding requirements within these countries. We did not consult with every country to confirm, but we did consult with an international group of experts on biosafety, biosecurity, to get their comments on the scoring and the metrics and see if there are any kind of issues with that. To the extent that people are able to identify additional biosafety, laws and regulations that maybe we missed, we'd certainly be interested in that. One of the challenges we had is that we looked at 27 different countries with, a lot of different languages, and we had to rely on some translation software and our own, translation abilities within the team. But one of the things that became very clear is that, different countries and different languages define biosafety and biosecurity very differently. And so interpreting these terms and interpreting the translation of these terms, was a challenge. But we did as, thorough of a job as possible. But again, we do welcome feedback on those areas as well. And we're able to also supplement, that work with the declarations that countries made to the Biological Weapons Convention, and also their submissions to the UN Security Council Resolution 1540 committee, where countries are supposed to report what legislation they have on the books for mostly related to biosecurity. So we did have a couple of different sources that we could triangulate and identify relevant, legislation and regulations. And we think it's quite valuable to see it this way and understand how different countries interpret biosafety and biosecurity. And again, in keeping with Filipa's discussion about the WHO guidance, understanding both how different countries vary within these categories, but also how they vary from kind of the international standards that are out there. And again, one of the overall objectives is to encourage countries, right, to raise the standards of their biorisk management governance. And that might entail adopting entirely new legislation, right? Because, for example, only one country in the world, Canada, has legislation dealing with dual use research. And so, we would like to see other countries adopt that. But for countries that do have biosafety, biosecurity legislation, right, there might be some gaps there. And so our work maybe will help highlight for countries where there are maybe some gaps that other countries have provided a template or a model for how to enhance regulations in that space to ensure that the research is being done as safely and securely as possible.
So there's a couple of questions that can make us think of next steps almost for us as a project. One is about map making, and what about labs that are situated in geo high risk areas? So labs that, for example, are based in earthquake prone zones or in hurricane zones or that are tsunami prone. It's not something we've looked at so far, but it certainly is something that we would consider adding as a kind of a context to where these labs are planned, because exactly where they're being built is, of course, an issue. It's something that we've talked about in relation to the population around it. Is it urban or non-urban? But yes, that's a good point. So thank you for that. There's a second question from David Spiro asking whether we have any thoughts on how to gauge the total growth of global research with potential pandemic pathogens. Certainly something that would be of interest. This is high risk research, a lot of it, and tracking it, I think, would be a real benefit. It can be a bit tricky. One of the things that is also coming out of our project that I just want to highlight is that all of the BSL4 labs or the max containment labs are not doing research with potential pandemic pathogens. It's a small number of labs that do research with potential pandemic pathogens, and certainly that manipulate potential pandemic pathogens. Most of the BSL4 labs are used for, clinical assessments and so on, and aren't doing this extreme high risk research. How do we track it? Well, there are different ways. I mean, you could track it through their publications, etc., through their funders, but it would be very difficult. I think it would be quite an extensive project, but still, thank you for the idea. It's a good one. There was another point about whether we're tracking the funding of individual labs. So we're not in any great detail. We are we've got data on whether it's a public health lab, whether it's a defense lab, whether it's a private lab, whether it's an academic lab. So that's the extent to which we're tracking the funding. There is some information available. Some labs, institutions, facilities are more open about their funding sources than others, but that's the sort of level at which we've decided to track the funding on. Two very quick ones. There's a comment on the Kazakhstan lab saying, it wasn't a question, it was just a comment to say there was a surprise. There was a BSL4 coming up in Kazakhstan, just to say that's a planned lab. So it was announced in 2021 and expected to come on stream in 2025. So it's not yet been built. And one that I really like is, hi, what's the takeaway message from all of this for, a lay person? And your next comment is right on, right? So should we be concerned that BSL4 labs are being built in countries that don't score well for biosafety, biosecurity, transparency, and stability, and may lack relevant expertise? Yes. That's exactly right. So what we're seeing is there is an upward trend in the number of labs, high containment facilities being built. That is not in and of itself a bad thing. These are institutions built to work safely with dangerous pathogens, to make sure the people that work with these pathogens don't affect themselves and don't affect others and the local community. So that's actually a good thing. The question is, how many of these labs do we need, right? Because we need some. We need to make sure we can operate safely with dangerous viruses and bacteria when, for instance, there is an outbreak, and to add to general knowledge about these viruses and bacteria. But it's not cost-free, essentially. There are risks to building these facilities, to doing this kind of a work. And so there's this very, very difficult question of, well, how many is enough? And so I think when we're looking at this globally, I think you can see there are areas that are very highly concentrated with labs, and perhaps we should think about having more sort of regional hubs of labs rather than each country having their own maximum containment facility, et cetera. So, and as you were saying, when we're looking at these trends, we are seeing countries that have never had labs before now wanting to build these facilities, and they don't have the legislative frameworks in place to do so safely, responsibly, and securely. And so that to us is a concern, and it is making these trends as publicly available as what we're trying to do here, and raising the awareness about this. We are trying, as I said earlier, to nudge. There was a comment about whether we're trying to shove them, perhaps, so that whether that's what they really need. But yes, it's an encouragement to make sure we have those laws and regulations in place. Over to you, Greg.
So there's a question from Multi-Dal about, in our experience, what's the attentiveness by lawmakers and international organizations such as the UN to these issues? I mean, the good news is that there is definitely much more increased interest in these issue areas. Just last year, the WHO published their global guidance framework for responsible use of the life sciences. And in that document, they adopted, the paradigm of biorisk management, which includes biosafety, biosecurity, and dual use research oversight. And that is a guidance document that they've now been going out and doing briefings to countries and to regions about how at the laboratory level or the national level or among civil society, they can adopt different measures in order to enhance, across the range of the biorisk management spectrum. So that's a very encouraging sign. And some of our recommendations to the WHO are designed to kind of give them more capacity to spread the word about biorisk management and to conduct additional trainings, education, and that sort of thing. So that's definitely a very good sign at the international level that this is making progress. the one area of concern is that this issue has also unfortunately become very politicized, and in some countries has become very, very partisan, and that's a real shame because pathogens don't care about politics. Pathogens don't care about party labels, right? And so we really need to be approaching biorisk management in a apolitical or bipartisan manner, because at the end of the day, a lab accident or a biosecurity breach anywhere in the world could affect everybody, and our global health security is only as strong as its weakest link. And so we need to be investing in biorisk management in order to reduce these risks across the board. And I would hope that's something that all countries, all political leaders can support and cooperate on. And that's one of the areas that we really hope we can see some progress in the near future on.
Thanks, Greg. A very final question coming in about the Lyon lab. So there's a lab in France, in Lyon, if that's a private lab. The lab that is being referred to is the Jean Mérieux lab, P4 lab. That was it was financed by the Mérieux Foundation, working on public health issues. So it's not a private lab, but it's also not a government lab. It's very much focused on public health. So with that, we've come to the end of our session. Obviously, Greg and I could go on forever talking about all of this. This is our absolute niche area, and we are the ultimate nerds when it comes to this, but we will let you all go. And please contact us via the website or via our email addresses. I think it's all been popped into the chat. It's been good to have you with us. Thank you so much for really, really engaging questions. I think looking at it, we've answered 31 questions. We've still got 10 open questions, and there's a couple more in there as well. So thank you so much for this engagement, and we'll keep doing what we're doing, and we hope you will continue to support us and to visit our site. So that's it for us for now. Do go read the report, and we'll be in touch with more data at some point soon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.